I remember one time, just to give you some background, that I was over at my brother's house, and it was probably about 1987. And I was just sitting with him, and I said, Bob, I see a man in front of you with a red turban, and your whole life is flashing before you. And my brother Bob said, you hang around with strange people and you do a lot of strange things. Maybe you should cut it out. And what you say, it sounds so crazy. So what happened was a couple of years later, he came down with what he thought was pneumonia or a flu or something. And the doctor gave him antibiotics, and it seemed to have cleared up. And 3 weeks later, it came back. And then it seemed to clear up again with the antibiotics. And then finally, it came back again, and they did a chest x-ray, and they said that he had spots on his lungs. And he should go to Sloan Kettering, and they were going to do this tube down his chest and throat area, and determine what was wrong with him. So the whole family, he was to go for this test, and I took a day off work. At that time, the family business was disbanded, and I was working jobs and also doing psychic fairs and teaching psychics and so forth. Like I said, for me, this always came easy. And what happened was the room was crowded. There was only like 4 or 5 chairs, and the doctor was to come in. And I was the youngest one in the family, even though I was in my 40s. And they all said, why don't you wait outside? I wanted to go in, but I didn't want to argue because he's nervous and the whole family's nervous. And then I saw the doctor, who was an East Indian gentleman called Dr. Baines, walking into the room, and he was wearing a red turban. And then it was determined that he had inoperable lung cancer. So what happened was he started having treatments, and eventually went to his brain and so forth and so on. And then a couple of years later, he had passed away. He went out with his wife, visiting some of her relatives. He went upstairs to get changed, and they found him on the floor. And that was the end of his life. And it all went back to a couple of years before his illness, when I said I saw him with a man with a red turban, and his whole life was flashing before his eyes. It had no meaning even to me. It just came out of my mouth. And that's what happens with psychic. Very often it's something that just comes out of your mouth, and you get used to being intuitive, and you just flow with it, when you're feeling it. What I always liked about the psychic work, I love dealing with the energy. I'm not a drinker, don't take drugs, but when I do psychic readings, I feel like I'm on a high, a natural high. I just, like I'm floating on the ceiling. I get that way very quickly when I'm reading. In fact, when I used to live at home with my parents, I used to get a regular deck of playing cards, and I would throw them on the table, and I would do it by the hour. To me, after a while, the cards started looking like a movie playing in my mind. I wasn't seeing cards, I was seeing a movie. And my father would say, look at him, all he does is throw those cards on the table and look at it. Isn't that the strangest thing you ever saw? And I didn't realize it, but I was actually training my mind to perceive things. And I didn't realize how I was. I remember one time I was at a mall in Long Island, and I was going to do a psychic fair. A lot of the psychic fairs were muscular dystrophy, telethon type of things, where they were fundraisers. I often volunteered and so forth. But on the marquee, it said that the water witch is going to be there. I didn't know what a water witch was. So he asked for a volunteer. I put my hand up, and I always tell people, this guy looked like somebody, he wore like an army type of camouflage suit. That's what it looked like, and they dropped him out of a helicopter somewhere. So he asked for a volunteer, and what had happened was he had this long rug that was maybe 50 or 60 feet uh, down the mall, the floor, along the floor, and he had hidden a wire under the rug someplace, which I didn't know. So he put these two coat hangers in my hands, which were like divining rods, and he said he put them straight out, and he said just walk this rug and think about a wire, a piece of metal. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, just walk. So I'm walking with this wire, piece of metal. All of a sudden it turned in my hand and it was hooked up to nothing. The wire under the rug was not hooked up to anything, and the two coat hangers were not hooked up to anything. And all of a sudden they turned in my hand like magic. And when I backed up, they straightened out. When I went forward, they turned to the side. It was like amazing to me. And that's the first time I heard of dowsing. And I found out that this guy was a famous guy that was a dowser, and he was on TV. He was called the Water Witch. And he used to find water or oil on people's property. And I asked him, I said, how much do you charge? He said, it depends on the car in the driveway. If it was a Cadillac, I charge more. He said, if it's a Volkswagen, I charge less. And he said, I get the people to help me. They'll put a stake in the ground. I tell them to go there and go there. And I make a big deal because if I find it in 2 minutes, they don't want to pay me. He said, so I have to make a big deal out of it. He said, but usually I can find it in a couple of minutes. And so it was interesting. A lot of people waiting at the mall for this guy. He was well known. It was called the Water Witch. And I happened to bump into him. I met a lot of people and characters doing this type of work. I was at the 1980 Parapsychology Conference in Atlantic City, and I was one of the psychics there. And they had a machine that you would grab these metal rods, and if it went into an altered state of consciousness, the bells would go off. And they hadn't gone off all day. And Vinny, who was running the show, said, Alan, why don't you grab the rods and start reading somebody? He started reading somebody, and the bells went right off. I always went into an altered state of consciousness real easy. It was a natural thing for me. I don't have the mediumship ability of some of these people, but when it comes to psychics and events, I can hold my own pretty good. That's really my ballpark. And I always tell people, don't try to be something you're not. Try to be who you are and what you're doing. And it seems like in modern times, this mediumship thing, which I have the greatest respect for, some of the practitioners are really amazingly good. It really is a worthwhile thing, and I find it interesting. But what we did in those days was divine people's lives. And it was a very competitive situation. I wound up being what they call multi-skilled. I was able to do so many things: handwriting, cards, regular cards, tarot cards, name analysis, the Kai Chi, the abracadabra, astronumerology. So I gave people a lot of reasons to come and sit at my table. A lot of people that were reading were like one-tune Charlies, and some people did psychometry where they would take an item that somebody owned and they would divine something uh, from the item in regards to them. But I always say, too, that palmistry has a lot of psychometry. In itself, you're holding somebody's hand and you get vibes out of that, as well as following the lines or inclinations in the people's hands. But the psychic field has always fascinated me, and to this day it still does. And I like to spark that interest in somebody else.